August 24, 1942. The Eastern Solomons. 1,610 hours local. The sea below is a patchwork of white streaks and torn salt spray. A TBF Avenger is cutting low, almost recklessly low, throttles forward, fuel dangerously light, and the pilot's voice on the intercom is thin and dry, the way a man sounds when he knows he is almost out of time and out of luck. Ahead, on the horizon, a Japanese fleet carrier is banking away hard to port, its full air group somewhere out there, its protective screen somewhere out there, and every second this ship is still alive is one more second Japan retains momentum in the South Pacific. Nobody in this aircraft will ever admit that what is about to happen is stupid. They will only say they chose what seemed to work. They will only say they did the American thing. They did not wait for permission. They used whatever they had. Inside this Avenger's belly, bolted and taped and braced inside a machine built in factories back in New Jersey and Connecticut, there is a Mark 13 torpedo. And next to the mechanical geometry of war, next to the oil and the steel and the riveted American aluminum, there is also one more thing. A small wooden plank. Nobody knows who first said it. Nobody knows who first tried it. But the men on the ground at Guadalcanal believed in it. Or maybe they were desperate enough to believe in anything at all. They believed that a tiny piece of wood, shaped and wedged just right, could calm the misbehavior of the Mark 13 at the final seconds of a low run. They believed that sometimes it is not the official improvement that changes history, but the anonymous trick that nobody writes down. If the Americans are going to win this war, they are going to need more than machinery. They will need ideas. And ideas in the South Pacific do not always have serial numbers. The Avenger begins its final run. It is almost criminally low. A wave surge could rip the belly open. The pilot is trusting that little piece of wood. He is trusting the hands of a ground crewman who probably learned the trick at a stateside school, from some old instructor who once said the quiet part out loud, who once whispered the truth nobody wanted written in any manual. Sometimes a crude thing, a thing you shouldn't even admit doing, is the thing that saves your life. If this torpedo hits this second carrier today, it will mean something. It will not simply mean a ship destroyed. It will mean the story of the American war is not the story of perfect doctrine or perfect weapons. It is the story of ordinary American minds trying to make sense of imperfect tools, in the heat of battle, in the absence of permission, in the absence of certainty. Did a single plank of wood really help aim a torpedo and sink not one but two Japanese carriers on a single day? If that is true, then the myth of American power is incomplete. If that is true, then the real secret is not the weapon. The real secret is the idea. Because America wins wars with ideas, not just weapons. And if you want to really understand what America was in the South Pacific, what America was in 1942, you cannot simply study what was authorized. You must also study what men actually did. This is a story about anonymous hands. About nameless, ordinary Americans who solved problems at the lowest level possible. About tiny decisions made in the heat of battle. About one plank of wood, shoved into a place nobody in Washington would ever approve, and how that might have changed one day in August 1942. If this is the kind of hidden, buried, forgotten American story you want more of, then subscribe right now. Because the story you think you know about World War II is not the full story. The full story is the story of ideas. The United States Navy had a torpedo problem. Not in theory. In theory, the Mark 13 should have been perfectly adequate. It had the right explosive mass. It had the right diameter. It had the right warhead chemistry. It had the correct length-to-diameter ratio to stabilize hydrodynamic entry. But in practice, it was a nightmare. Between the spring of 1942 and the fall of 1942, American carrier aviators slowly realized the one fact their superiors absolutely did not want to write in any official report. The Mark 13 was unpredictable. Some would skate. Some would tumble. Some would porpoise. Some would fail to arm. Some would run too deep. Some would break on water impact. The most humiliating failure mode was the one nobody wanted to say out loud. Sometimes the torpedo simply belly flopped like a dead fish. The cultural problem was even worse. The doctrine was dated. Pre-war tactical training still assumed dive from moderate altitude, clean drop, and a smooth water entry. The Pacific was not cooperating. Sea state, spray, troughs, white caps, the geometry of fast low ships. Everything was conspiring against the theoretical Mark 13 envelope. A weapon does not care about theory. A weapon cares about reality. And the reality was that the only way to get reliable hits in the Solomons environment was dangerously low and dangerously close. That is where the superstition was born. Nobody remembers exactly who said it first. The recollections are all fragmentary. One radio man says he heard it from an old torpedo man at NAS Pensacola. A crew chief insists he saw it written on a chalkboard once in a stateside shop. A pilot swears he heard it from a Marine Ordnance man unloading crates at Noumea. But by late July 1942, the rumor had matured into one sentence that kept repeating itself all across Guadalcanal. A small wood insert on the aft support kills the oscillation. It sounded stupid. It sounded like folklore. It sounded like a cargo cult hack from men who had run out of formal explanations. And yet, the men who tried it swore it worked. It wasn't magic. It wasn't voodoo. It was crude applied physics. The idea was simple. If you stiffen the afterbody preload, if you change the stress at the back end of the torpedo by a few millimeters, you altered the impulsive response at water entry. It wasn't enough to ruin the balance. It wasn't enough to foul the drop. But it was enough to kill the initial chaotic oscillation. It was the difference between a clean underwater run and a random underwater tumble. The irony is that this kind of analog thinking was normal in the United States industrial culture of the 1920s and 1930s. American shop instructors routinely taught shim logic. If something vibrates, shim it. If something chatters, shim it. If something racks, shim it. If something misbehaves, give it a preload. The men who built the industrial America that won World War II had learned this doctrine from old machinists, old foundry hands, old boilermen, old millwrights. So it is not an accident that the greatest navy of the industrial age solved a frontline torpedo stability problem not with a new design, not with a new factory, not with a new spec, but with a shim. A shim the thickness of a carpenter's scrap. This is the part the official historians never like telling. This is the part the procurement bureaucrats never want in the books. Because this is the part that makes America look exactly like what it really was. A culture where the last 5% of performance was always solved at the lowest possible level by ordinary workers without permission. It was mechanics solving what engineers refused to admit. It was enlisted men solving what officers refused to write in reports. The discovery of the wooden shim is not an isolated anecdote. It is the purest possible microscopic case study of the entire American way of war. When the doctrine failed, when the spec was wrong, when the theory collapsed, the Americans did not argue philosophy. They reached for a scrap. And they made it work. At this stage of the war, America was not yet the overwhelming superindustrial power of 1944. America was still scrambling. America was still learning. America was still absorbing blood lessons in real time. The surface impression, the myth, is that America crushed Japan simply by producing more ships, more planes, more steel. That is not the real story. The real story is that the Americans learned faster. They adjusted faster. They iterated faster. They debugged reality while Japan was still defending doctrine. The wood shim on the Mark 13 is the smallest physical symbol of that advantage. It is the most American detail imaginable. And it happened in the dirty hours between formal doctrine and real war. Nobody operating the front end of the Pacific War had time for ideology. Things either worked on target or they did not. And in the Solomons, everybody learned the same brutal law. You could not hide behind theory. The only metric that mattered was what the pilot saw after pickle. Did the torpedo enter smooth? Did the torpedo track clean? Did the torpedo explode under the target? Those three questions determined everything. The wood shim superstition would have remained pure folklore if not for one very particular encounter. A nameless American flight deck chief, aboard a light carrier in 1943, decided that enough rumor existed to justify a deliberate operational test. He didn't log it. He didn't ask permission. He didn't write a memo. He picked a single TBD replacement bird. He picked a single ordnance crew. He told his men to insert the wooden strip on one torpedo and leave the other one stock standard. Then he assigned two pilots who knew they were flying identical attack geometry. The target was not a capital ship. The target was logistics. A Japanese fast transport, one of the many express runners in the island chain. A thin hull. A small displacement. The kind of ship that had just enough value to be worth killing but not enough value to justify wasting scarce torpedoes. This was an ideal test. 2 planes. 2 torpedoes. 2 drops. Only one tiny difference. Nobody involved in that run talked about it at the time. The reports filed back up the chain were sterile, dry, clean, sanitized. 2 torpedoes released at appropriate attack parameters. 1 confirmed miss. 1 underwater detonation observed. That is how history sanitizes the moment a culture changes. The enlisted men on that deck did not need paperwork. They had eyes. They saw the first torpedo, the stock standard, shutter, skip, and deflect. It hit the water slightly nose up, then dug steep, then actually corkscrewed. It never came back into stable track, and by the time it killed its oscillation it was nowhere near the target track lane. The second torpedo, the one with the tiny piece of carpenter's scrap, behaved differently. It bit clean. It tracked like a textbook hydrodynamics model. It ran through the shallow chop like the Pacific was a lake. A few seconds later, the water under the Japanese transport lifted. That detonation was the single most important A-B test in the entire early war torpedo debugging story. Nobody called it that, but that is what it was. 2 versions. 1 variable changed. Direct outcome difference observed. The men on that flight deck understood exactly what they had just proven. A weapon that was supposed to represent the highest level of American naval procurement engineering had just been improved by the same class of people the textbooks and the bureaucratic chain typically ignored. Blue-collar enlisted technicians. America didn't win that run because they had more formal knowledge. America won that run because the men who touched the real metal had the authority to impose reality on the weapon. The cultural significance is enormous. Japan still believed doctrine was to be obeyed. America had just proven that doctrine could be hacked. From that moment on, every carrier ordnance shop in the region understood the signal. The official chain would not acknowledge the hack. The official chain would not authorize it. The official chain would not endorse it. But nobody could deny the result. The wood shim spread the way all great American industrial truths spread, horizontally, not vertically. From enlisted man to enlisted man. From petty officer to petty officer. From shop to shop. From squadron to squadron. Whispered. Implied. Never written down explicitly. But every man understood exactly what they were doing. America is the only power in that war capable of this kind of folk optimization. Not because the United States had more factories. Not because the United States had more chemistry. Not because the United States had more aluminum. But because America did not worship theory. America worshipped results. That is the real operational proof phase of this story. This is where we see the exact hinge point. Before this moment, the Mark 13 was an unreliable, sometimes humiliating weapon. After this moment, the Mark 13 became a flexible, tunable platform. The difference between unreliable and tunable is not engineering. The difference between unreliable and tunable is culture. Japan could not culturally allow a field expedient hack that contradicted doctrine. America could. And that is why the American wooden shim superstition is not a footnote. It is the central hinge of the Pacific torpedo story. When the theory collapsed, the enlisted class debugged the weapon at the point of contact. This is the exact moment where the United States Navy transitions from pre-war ideal weapon theory to wartime empirical iteration. A tiny wooden sliver, a shim that cost nothing, became the symbol of the entire American advantage. Because it proved that the United States Navy did not merely have more material. It proved the United States Navy had a different cognitive operating system. One that would, over the next 2 years, industrialize this same trial and error ethos into the biggest wartime production machine in world history. From the outside, later histories make it look like the United States Navy suddenly got serious about fixing the Mark 13 problem sometime in mid-1943 and early 1944. That is not what happened. What actually happened is that the Navy was dragged, unwillingly, into formalizing what the enlisted men had already solved informally. The first step in this phase was simple pattern recognition. After enough field units started reporting improved stability at low-level drop, the statisticians in the rear could no longer maintain the pre-war assumption envelope. The reality on paper now matched the reality in the cockpit. Lower and slower worked. Which, translated into actual human language, means the hack worked. The Navy never admitted the wooden shim directly. They never wrote wooden shim in any official engineering change order. But the cultural surrender showed up indirectly in one measurement. The officially recommended drop envelope shifted downward. That is the true formalization. Not a memo that said, "We were wrong," but a memo that quietly moved the numbers. Somewhere between the autumn of 1943 and the spring of 1944, the United States Navy crossed a line. Instead of pretending the torpedo was fine and the pilots were misusing it, they accepted the fact that frontline operational improvisation had revealed the weapon's true performance envelope. This is the pivot. Before, doctrine defines reality. After, reality defines doctrine. It is impossible to overstate how big that pivot is. Because after that pivot, the Mark 13 stops being a stubborn liability and starts being a field-tunable weapon. It goes from embarrassment to solvable engineering object. And once the mental frame changes, the entire American industrial apparatus behaves differently. You can see it in the paperwork velocity. Suddenly, reports that would have been smothered or diluted now get pushed up. Suddenly, small pattern signals get aggregated. Suddenly, petty officers are treated like signal sources, not noise. Suddenly, a test run that was once dismissed as anecdotal becomes informative. And this is where the real acceleration comes in. Because once the Navy crossed the cultural line, the rest was inevitable. If the torpedo is now considered tunable, then the question becomes, what other cheap tunings exist? Which then triggers a new industrial posture. We need to redesign this entire weapon so that it is forgiving. The wooden shim hack did not merely fix the Mark 13's early chaos problem. The wooden shim hack taught the Navy that the Mark 13 could be fixed. That was the true strategic win. Once you accept that a weapon can be tuned by mere mortals, you open the way to the industrial avalanche that would follow. The drag ring. The nose fairing adjustments. The tail fin improvements. The hydrodynamic damping tweaks. None of that would have happened if the Navy still believed the torpedo was finished. The wooden shim destroyed the illusion of final specification. This is the hidden hinge of the entire story. Because once the shim kills the myth of final spec, the Navy becomes exactly what the American industrial system always was at its best. A giant machine that eats empirical insight and outputs optimized hardware. Japan could not pivot like this. Japan still worshipped final answers. America worshipped iterability. By mid-1943, all the big levers are aligning. The frontline men believe the weapon is tunable. The rear echelon analysts are forced to accept that the data says the same thing. The American industrial economy is reaching maximum war footing capacity. That combination is lethal. Because once America aligns culture plus analysis plus heavy industry, there is no stopping the curve. The wooden shim is microscopic, but the causal effect is macro scale. Once the Navy internalizes the principle that low-cost physical interventions can transform a weapon's effective reliability curve, the entire psychology of American weapons development changes from defensive to invasive. You see this reflex again and again in late-war American systems. Radar bands hacked to pierce Japanese ECM, P-38 intercooler bypass behavior, Hellcat cowl flap trim games, B-29 ignition timing manipulations. The Americans became compulsive tuners. The wooden shim is where that impulse becomes doctrine. That is why this ramp-up phase matters. Because it is where the United States Navy, for the first time, accepts that a weapon is not a static object that you issue to the field. It is a living system that the field teaches you to make better. From that moment, the Mark 13 is no longer a torpedo. It is a platform. In America, the biggest breakthroughs do not always start with the intellectual class. They often start where the dirt and sweat live. They start with the men who hold the tools. This is the part of the war that textbooks skip. They will write about Nimitz. They will write about King. They will write about the industrial miracle of Detroit and Willow Run. And they are not wrong. But they will skip the small thing. They will skip the way idea flow actually worked in 1942. America in World War II was not a pyramid of pure authority. It was a distributed network of personal agency. It worked like this. A kid from Tulsa learns something in one shop, then tells a guy from Oakland while they are smoking at 2 a.m., then the Oakland guy hands the trick to a newcomer from Scranton on a pier at Espiritu Santo, and the next day that same trick is being executed in the bomb bay of a combat aircraft over the Pacific. This is the real American engine. It is folk engineering. It is the belief that you always try the thing. And you do not wait for a memo. When the wooden shim spreads through the TBF communities at Guadalcanal, what you are looking at is not luck. It is the structural national advantage of a culture that does not shame the enlisted mind. America, unlike Imperial Japan, did not consider improvisation a sign of disorder. America considered improvisation a sign of intelligence. When you really study the Guadalcanal campaign, What jumps off the page is not merely courage. Every nation had courage. Courage was not the differentiator. The differentiator was the American belief that if the tool is wrong, fix the tool. Most nations punish the man who points out that the sacred tool is wrong. America promotes him. That is the American way. This is why that plank of wood matters. It is not magic. It is not myth. It is a physical artifact of the American national personality in wartime. The average enlisted man in the United States military believed three things simultaneously. 1. The officers do not know everything. 2. The engineers do not know everything. 3. The enemy is trying to kill me today, not in a theoretical future. So if something must be done today, then I will do the thing today. This mindset becomes American doctrine. You see it in the way the U.S. Navy adapts CAS procedures. You see it in the way Seabees improvise in the field. You see it in the way radar operators hack antenna tilt in real time to fight surface targets. This is the American way. You can feel the cultural difference if you imagine the Japanese equivalent moment. Imagine a Japanese torpedo squadron sailor in 1942 trying to wedge a piece of wood to fix a Type 91. That person would be committing a cultural sin. In America, that same act is not sin. In America, that same act is the point. America wins wars because the men closest to the problem believe they are allowed to touch the problem. When you give a free man the right to think, you unlock his mind. And a mind in the field is more valuable than 1,000 pages of doctrine drafted by men who have never smelled engine oil in the tropics. This is why America eventually becomes unstoppable in the Pacific. The Japanese system was optimized for obedience. The American system was optimized for creativity. Creativity is more lethal. Creativity shortens wars. Creativity changes the slope of history. When the Mark 13 becomes the signature American weapon in the final 2 years of the Pacific War, when it becomes the torpedo that vaporizes the navy of an empire, you must remember what unlocked that outcome. Not simply mass production, but mass permission. The permission to hack. The permission to tune. The permission to fix the world with the thing at hand, even if the thing at hand is a small piece of wood. That is the American way. The weapon is not the weapon. The mind is the weapon. The Japanese mortgaged the war on hardware. The Americans mortgaged the war on human creativity. This is the part people miss when they talk about the arsenal of democracy. America did not win because it had more machines. America won because it had more minds. August 24, 1942. Late afternoon. East of Maleta. The Avenger flight is small. The weather is ugly. The sea surface is disturbed and irregular like 1,000 animal backs rolling under a gray fur coat. Nobody in this formation feels like they are doing the second half of a glorious set piece that some future book will call The Eastern Solomons. They feel like they are pushing a rotten grocery cart with a cracked wheel, and the floor of the supermarket is on fire. That is the emotional truth of this moment. You are not thinking about history. You are thinking about not dying. On the intercom, the pilot's voice is tight but not panicked. He is not eloquent. He is not poetic. He is just trying not to screw up the one thing he can still control: attitude, throttle, approach angle. They have already dropped once today. They have already burned more fuel than planned. Every number that matters is trending the wrong direction. And yet they are lining up on another Japanese fleet carrier. No aircraft in the world at this moment is flying a more consequential run. This is the turning point. Not because the second carrier is guaranteed to be hit, but because this little wooden shim, this nothing little artifact of folk knowledge, is about to be tested under maximum existential load. The pilot slides the Avenger lower. Even lower. The crew feels the belly of the aircraft skim the mental line where water contact becomes almost probable. But low is what the Mark 13 wants. Low is what the wooden shim makes possible. Low is where the Mark 13 stops tumbling like a drunk man and starts behaving like a weapon. Now the pilot is talking more quietly. Not because he is calm. Because he is trying to keep his breathing under control. All the crewmen in this airplane are at a point where any additional stress could push them into freezing up or over-controlling. They are on the razor's edge. They do not say this in words. But the meaning is in the silence between the words. Then the moment. Throttle stable. Nose slightly down. Release. The torpedo leaves the aircraft cleanly. That is the first miracle. Because if the departure is not clean, you abort your dream right there. But the departure is clean. And the Avenger jumps a fraction upward, its weight changed, its fate now committed. Now all you can do is hope. This is the most American moment in the entire war. Because at this specific second, the stakes are absurdly mismatched. On one side, the floating industrial miracle of a Japanese fleet carrier, thousands of tons of steel, a nation's treasure. On the other side, one torpedo whose alignment in its cradle has been influenced by a sliver of wood a man cut and sanded with his own hands. This is exactly how real history often is. Not the clash of perfect machines. The clash of imperfect machines plus imperfect men who reach for absolute clarity in the chaos. The Avenger turns away. Violent lateral bank. The gunner is holding on. The radio operator has clenched muscles as if he is carrying half the airplane on his own body. And for half a minute, nobody talks. Then they hear something on the intercom that sounds like disbelief wrapped inside hope. The pilot says it as if he is afraid to say it too loud. It's running straight. Those 3 words. That is the moment the United States Navy crosses from theory to conviction. The torpedo is not tumbling. The torpedo is not porpoising. The torpedo is not diving into useless depth. The torpedo is riding out clear and clean. The second stretch. And then the sound. Not heard but felt. Even from the cockpit windows, even at that distance, the column of water tells the truth. There is a strike. They do not celebrate. Not yet. Because they do not know if the carrier will survive the strike. They do not know if the enemy damage control will contain it. They do not know if Japanese luck will invalidate this tiny American act. But in their hearts, this is the turning point. Because they have just proven something deadly serious. This weapon can be shaped. This weapon can be tuned. This weapon can be fixed by the men who actually have to use it. Later that night, when they land, nobody does a scientific debrief. Nobody graphs it. Nobody does a statistical regression analysis. Nobody draws a neat diagram. They just talk about it like men talk when they return from the edge of death. Simple sentences. Simple nouns. I think that damn would actually helped. And the legend spreads again. Not because somebody writes a white paper. But because one crew survived long enough to tell another crew, and another crew tells another crew. And one day that little contagious sentence will reach a bureaucrat who is smart enough to listen. This is the turning point. This is the moment where the war turns from, we have a defective torpedo, to we can make this torpedo kill carriers. And once the men feel that in their bones all the rest is merely time, America becomes inevitable. Japan begins its long collapse. History turns on tiny hinges. Sometimes a hinge is a decision made by a head of state. Sometimes a hinge is a document signed in a capital city. But sometimes a hinge is a sliver of wood jammed into a machine by a man whose name nobody will ever know. After August 24, 1942, the story becomes less cinematic and more statistical. But that does not make it less dramatic. Because the impact is not only, it sank a carrier. The impact is that the culture of American warfighting crossed a psychological threshold. From this point forward, the Mark 13 is no longer the problem child of the torpedo family. It becomes a weapon that pilots trust. Trust is the most valuable currency in combat aviation. Trust increases usage. Trust encourages repetition. Trust produces a flood of empirical runs. That flood becomes data. Data becomes feedback. Feedback becomes intelligent iteration. And iteration is how the United States wins the Pacific. The first visible impact. Frontline Avenger pilots start going lower without argument. They abandon the older high-altitude, high-speed doctrine that was essentially written around a broken weapon. They now commit to the lower band. They commit to the field truth. They commit to the place where the weapon behaves like a weapon. And the hit probability jumps. The second impact. Ground crews stop hiding their hacks. They stop whispering. They stop acting like they are doing something that would get them hauled before some stern ordnance review board. They begin to talk in the open. They begin to aggressively share technique. You can picture this scene. Night 10. 2 mechanics eating whatever half ration of whatever half-warm thing they have that evening. One says, "We tried that shim again today. It tracks cleaner. No shame. No secrecy. It is now acceptable to solve the problem." The third impact. The rear analysis pipeline is now forced to reconcile that the war is being won by field innovation. That forces a structural shift in how the American Navy treats enlisted origin improvement. The Mark 13 becomes the case study for this change. It is the first ugly truth weapon that the Navy bends toward the lived reality of the men who have to use it. Once that reorientation happens, the Navy becomes permanently more lethal. By late 1943 and early 1944, the shift becomes geometrically large. Because now the Navy is pouring out Avengers by the thousand. The production curve is now a tsunami. And once the curve is aligned to a correct employment envelope, the kill curve becomes terrifying. We can trace the downstream effects. More carriers hit, more cruisers opened up, more destroyers crippled, more transports turned into boiling cauldrons of steel. And every time a Japanese ship rolls over and burns and dies, you can draw a causal line back to that tiny psychological turn. The moment the Navy accepted that the field hack was real. This is how small ideas change the world. Now zoom out beyond the torpedo. The cultural impact becomes even bigger. Because the Mark 13 story becomes the seed crystal of a new American identity. The identity that a weapon is not a fixed thing. A weapon is a tunable living thing. This insight infects everything. Carrier doctrine. Anti-shipping doctrine. Submarine doctrine. Night fighting doctrine. Radar employment doctrine. Fast carrier TF logistics doctrine. America goes from respecting doctrine to iterating doctrine. That is the real impact. And there is one more thing. A deep moral thing. A deep American thing. The impact of the shim hack is that it proves something most nations never learn. The individual enlisted mind in the field is not merely a replaceable part. The individual enlisted mind is a source of innovation. When you empower that mind, you get genius. Japan never understood this. Japan believed that genius sits at the top of the hierarchy. America believed that genius can appear anywhere. That is what democracy is at its core. The belief that wisdom is not exclusive to the elite. The shim is democracy made physical. The shim is the working man saying, I can fix reality myself. And the war rewards that belief. Because history does not care who is supposed to have authority. History only cares who actually solved the problem. That is the impact. The Mark 13 becomes lethal. The United States becomes unstoppable. The Japanese momentum breaks. You can trace entire future operational arcs from this small hinge. The American march across the Central Pacific becomes inevitable not just because America can mass produce, but because America can mass produce improvement. Most nations can mass produce things. America can mass produce better things. That is the ultimate multiplier. Legacy is not about whether the shim was written into a maintenance manual. Legacy is about what the war chose to remember. And here is the brutal truth. The war did not remember any single name. No one gets credit. No citation. No commendation. No medal. No footnote in the official naval history series. The tiny idea that changed the entire lethality curve of the U.S. Navy survives only as a ghost in the after-action statistics. That is the strange quiet cruelty of legacy in industrial war. The system absorbs the gain. The individual who created the gain dissolves into the machinery. In 1946, after the war ends, the U.S. Navy does a massive institutional memory crystallization. They produce thousands of pages of summary, analysis, monograph, doctrinal closure. They draw the official story of how the Pacific War was won. You will not find the shim. It is not there. Because the official narrative must present the American war as inevitable, linear, the logical expression of American industrial strength married to American technological genius. They need the story to be clean. The story is not clean. The real story is that American victory is built on a million micro-corrections from men who never get named. That is the legacy. The second component of legacy is doctrinal. After the Mark 13, the Navy never again fully trusts a laboratory-only weapon spec. The Navy permanently institutionalizes this bias. Data comes from the fleet, not from the test range. This mindset becomes dogma in the 1950s, then becomes culture in the 1960s, then becomes the backbone of American naval aviation forever. This is the DNA that later produces Sidewinder. Sidewinder is born in a garage on a base. Sidewinder becomes the most influential air-to-air weapon of the Cold War. Same pattern. Bottom-up genius. Field-tunable kit. Iterated until it kills. You can draw the lineage from the shim to Sidewinder. This is not an exaggeration. This is the actual through line of American ordnance culture. Legacy from the Mark 13 is also that the Navy arrives at a mathematically correct identity. If you integrate ideas from the bottom, you win wars faster than the enemy can model you. Japan never adapted at that speed. Japan never democratized innovation at the deck plate. Japan believed that authority equals correctness. America believed that correctness equals whoever solved the physics. That is the legacy. And the final legacy is philosophical. This story proves that every war contains two wars. The visible war of ships and planes and explosions. The invisible war of ideas and hacks and kludges. The visible war is the boring one. It is the one that you can see on newsreels and on museum plaques. The invisible war is the real one. That is where the fate of empires shifts. That is where the outcome is actually determined. That is where one night of unrecorded tinkering produces the hinge on which the next 5 years of naval destruction turns. So what is the legacy? It is this. Victory is a function of who solves the last unsolved problem first. Sometimes that solution is a new weapons architecture. Sometimes that solution is a new carrier doctrine. Sometimes that solution is a new metabolic model for logistics. And sometimes that solution is a sliver of wood. This is why this story matters. Because the entire future American national myth is built on this exact moral axis. The working American mind can create tactical genius without asking permission. Legacy is not the record. Legacy is the inheritance of a pattern. That pattern becomes the American weapon. They came back into Henderson Field in late afternoon. The sun was dropping. The light was orange and dusty. Guadalcanal dirt was all over everything. The wooden crates, the tires, the bomb dollies, the knees of the mechanics, the faces of the pilots. Nobody needed to talk. Nobody needed to narrate what happened. The silence itself was the evidence that the Americans had just done something that mattered. Ground crews pulled chocks. The Avengers cooled in the heat haze. Someone walked by with a clipboard but didn't say a word. This was what daylight looked like when ideas survive contact. And you could feel the theme of the entire Pacific War condensed into this one moment. Not the big grand staff plan in Washington, not the perfect doctrine in some neat binder, but this weird, dirty, improvised thing that only Americans could have pulled off. We do not win by perfect plans. We win by figuring out what works right now. History wants war to be about the big strategic brains at the top. But the actual vector of victory in the Pacific was always decided on the red volcanic dirt, in the heads and hands of anonymous Americans. Men with no glory, no historian attached to their name, no future lecture hall to honor them, just guys who made things work because they had to. That is the real outro of this story. It is not the explosion. It is not the carrier burning. It is this, the quiet walk back to the tent line at Guadalcanal, with the dust glowing in the sinking light, knowing that you did not wait for someone to allow you to try something. You tried it. And it worked. America wins wars with ideas, not just weapons. That line is not poetry. That line is not metaphor. That line is the only accurate single-sentence description of why the United States wins industrial wars. Because anyone can build hardware. The United States built an engine of bottom-up thinking. This story, a shim, a sliver of wood, no inventor's name, is the purest case study of that. It is the single most American maneuver in the entire war. A hack that turns into a kill, a folk idea that becomes lethal, a nameless mechanic who changes the curvature of history without even knowing he did it. The war never remembered him. But we can. And we should. Because the future of war will not be decided by who has the most perfect slide deck or the most polished procurement process. The future will be decided by which country has the healthiest culture of fast, fearless, field-level invention. If this story teaches anything, it is this. Honor the anonymous American hands. Honor the ground crew minds. Honor the quiet hacks. Honor the nameless genius that never made it into the official record. Because the record is not where victory lives. Victory lives in the idea that worked, exactly when it needed to,